What would you do if you found a crying newborn in a freezing dumpster behind a luxury high-rise? Most people would instantly call the police. But when 24-year-old Sarah pulled a custom leather duffel bag from the trash, she didn't just find a baby. She found a massive target on her back. That infant belonged to the most feared syndicate leader in Chicago. Returning her could mean a massive reward, but in the ruthless, blood-soaked world of the Moretti family, it usually means a bullet to the head. The Chicago wind off Lake Michigan in late November doesn't just blow, it bites. It slices through cheap coats and settles deep into your bones. For 24-year-old Sarah Jenkins, the cold was just another bill she couldn't afford to pay. Working her second double shift of the week for Elite Sweeps, a high-end cleaning service that catered to the disgustingly wealthy residents of the Astor Street district, Sarah was running on empty. Her life was an endless cycle of scrubbing marble floors, polishing silver fixtures, and handing over every single paycheck to the collection agencies, hounding her for her late mother's staggering medical debts at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. It was 2:15 a.m. The towering luxury apartment building was dead quiet, the kind of heavy insulated silence that only money could buy. Sarah hauled the last 2 oversized heavy-duty trash bags out the back service door and into the dark cobblestone alleyway. The floodlight above the dumpsters had been shattered for 3 days, leaving the alcove bathed in the eerie orange glow of a distant street lamp. Sarah threw the first bag into the massive metal bin. As she lifted the second, a sound stopped her dead in her tracks. It wasn't the scuttle of a rat or the rustle of the wind. It was a faint, muffled whimper. She froze her breath, pluming in the freezing air. She listened intently. There it was again. A tiny, rhythmic, suffocated cry coming from deep inside the partially open dumpster to her left. Sarah's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Chicago alleys at 2 a.m. were notorious for hiding terrible secrets, but this sounded terrifyingly human. Pulling her thin scarf over her nose against the stench of rotting food and expensive waste, she leaned over the cold metal edge of the dumpster. Buried beneath a pile of discarded cardboard boxes and half-empty bottles of Dom Perignon was a dark, heavy canvas duffel bag. It looked entirely out of place, a high-end, custom-made piece of luggage casually tossed into the filth. The whimpering was coming directly from inside the bag. Panic seized Sarah's throat. With trembling hands, she reached down her fingers, scraping against the icy canvas, and pulled the heavy bag toward her. She hoisted it over the edge and set it gently on the snow-dusted pavement. The zipper was top-tier thick brass, and it was closed almost all the way to the end, leaving only a tiny inch of space for air. "Please don't be what I think it is. Please," Sarah whispered to herself, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the metal tab. She pulled the zipper back. Lying inside, wrapped tightly in a man's blood-soaked tailored suit jacket, was a newborn baby. The infant couldn't have been more than a few months old. Her tiny face was red and blotchy from crying, her lips taking on a dangerous, terrifying shade of blue from the freezing temperatures. "Oh my God!" Sarah gasped, dropping to her knees on the icy concrete. She immediately scooped the baby out of the bag, wrapping her own cheap, worn-out wool coat around the infant to transfer whatever body heat she had left. The baby let out a sharper, more desperate wail as the freezing air hit her face. As Sarah pulled the infant close, something caught the dim orange light. Secured loosely around the baby's tiny wrist was a heavy, solid gold bracelet. It wasn't just any jewelry, it was custom engraved. Sarah squinted in the dark. The engraving wasn't a name. It was a crest, a snarling wolf wrapped in thorned vines. A cold sweat broke out over Sarah's body, completely unrelated to the winter chill. Growing up in the rougher edges of the city, and cleaning the penthouses of the elite you learned things. You heard whispers. That crest didn't belong to a corporation or a country club. It belonged to the Moretti family. Lorenzo Moretti was a ghost to the public, but a god in the underworld. He controlled the docks, the unions, and half the politicians in the state. He was known to be a man of sophisticated taste and absolutely barbaric violence. And this baby had his family crest strapped to her wrist, stuffed into a duffel bag, and thrown out with the trash like a piece of garbage. Sarah's first instinct, the one drilled into every law-abiding citizen, was to dial 911. She reached into her pocket for her cracked smartphone, dialing the first 2 digits, but then her thumb hovered over the screen. She remembered Detective Riley, the local precinct officer, who moonlighted as security for the very building she was standing behind. She had seen Riley take thick manila envelopes from men in sharp suits in this exact alleyway. If the Moretti family wanted this baby dead, and clearly someone did, wrapping her in a bloody jacket and tossing her in a dumpster to freeze, handing the child over to the Chicago police, was a death sentence. The cops were on the payroll. The baby would vanish before she ever reached the foster system. The baby whimpered again, nuzzling her freezing face against Sarah's collarbone. "Okay." Sarah breathed, her voice trembling. "Okay, I've got you. I'm not leaving you here." Knowing she had only minutes before the building's night manager did his rounds, Sarah stuffed the bloody jacket and the gold bracelet into her backpack. She zipped her own coat all the way up, tucking the baby safely against her chest, hidden from view. Keeping to the shadows, Sarah Jenkins walked out of the alley, carrying a secret that was about to turn her miserable, quiet life into a war zone. The ride back to her neighborhood on the L train was an exercise in pure terror. Every time the train rattled and the doors hissed open, Sarah expected a hit squad to walk through the doors. She sat rigidly in the corner of the empty car, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso, feeling the tiny rhythmic rising and falling of the baby's chest against her own. The infant had stopped crying, exhausted from the cold, and was now sleeping fitfully. Sarah lived in Pilsen in a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment above a noisy 24-hour laundromat. The rent was cheap, the locks were flimsy, and the radiator only worked when you hit it with a wrench. As soon as she locked her door, throwing the deadbolt and sliding the heavy chain into place, she rushed to her small bathroom. She turned on the space heater, filling the small tiled room with warmth, and finally unzipped her coat. In the harsh fluorescent light of the bathroom, the reality of the situation hit her like a freight train. The baby was stunningly beautiful, with a head of thick, dark curls and pale olive skin. But she was freezing. Sarah quickly filled the small sink with warm water, gently unwrapping the child. She bathed the infant quickly, washing away the smell of the dumpster and the faint smears of dried blood that had transferred from the tailored jacket. She dried the baby with her softest towel, wrapping her tightly in a clean, faded fleece blanket. Having no baby supplies, Sarah had stopped at an all-night bodega near her apartment, using the last $20 in her bank account to buy a can of powdered formula and a cheap plastic bottle. Sitting on her worn-out thrift store sofa, Sarah fed the baby. The infant drank ravenously, her tiny hands gripping the plastic bottle. For a brief, surreal moment, the apartment was peaceful. Then Sarah turned on the small, boxy television, sitting on a milk crate in the corner. She flipped the channel to the local 24-hour news network. The banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen was bright red. Breaking news massacre at Lake Forest Estate. Search underway. Sarah's blood ran cold. She turned up the volume. The news anchor looked genuinely shaken. Authorities are currently at the scene of a massive shootout at an exclusive compound in Lake Forest. Sources confirm the estate belongs to prominent businessman Lorenzo Moretti. Police are reporting multiple casualties, including Moretti's wife Isabella, who was found deceased in the primary residence. Furthermore, an Amber Alert has been issued. The couple's 3-month-old daughter Mia is missing. Authorities believe she was abducted during the attack. A picture flashed on the screen. It was a candid shot of Lorenzo Moretti. He had piercing dark eyes, a sharp aristocratic jawline, and an aura of absolute dominance that translated even through a photograph. Next to him was a beautiful woman holding a bundle in a pink blanket. Sarah looked down at the baby in her arms. Mia. Her name was Mia. "They didn't abduct you," Sarah whispered to the sleeping child, the horrifying truth clicking into place. "They tried to execute you. They tried to make you disappear." The blood on the jacket in the duffel bag. It must have been from one of the bodyguards, or worse, the mother Isabella. Someone inside Lorenzo's inner circle had orchestrated this hit. Someone who wanted Lorenzo's entire bloodline wiped off the map. Sarah's mind raced. What was she supposed to do if she went to the police? The corrupt cops on the payroll of the traitor would intercept Mia and finish the job. If she went directly to Lorenzo Moretti, how could she even get near a man heavily guarded and currently grieving a murdered wife? His men would shoot her on sight, assuming she was part of the hit squad returning the body for ransom. She was trapped, a poor, invisible maid with no power, no money, and no connections, holding the most valuable hunted human being in the city of Chicago. She laid Mia down gently in the center of her bed, building a makeshift barricade of pillows around her. Then Sarah walked over to her kitchen table and dumped out her backpack. The bloody suit jacket fell onto the cheap linoleum. She needed to check it. Maybe there was a clue, a phone number, something to tell her who to trust. She patted down the pockets of the ruined bespoke jacket. In the inside breast pocket, her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. She pulled it out. It was a thick silver money clip, but there was no cash inside. Instead, wedged tightly into the clip, was a small, smooth, black plastic disc. Sarah stared at it, her brow furrowing in confusion. It wasn't a coin. It had a tiny, blinking green light on the edge. Her breath hitched. A GPS tracker. She had brought a live tracker directly into her apartment. Panic exploded in her chest. She grabbed the disc, rushing toward the window, intending to throw it into the alley below. But before her hand could even reach the latch of the frosted glass, the sound of screeching tires echoed from the street outside. Sarah froze. She peeked through the dusty blinds. Down below, parked haphazardly in front of the 24-hour laundromat, were 3 matte black SUVs. The doors flew open in unison. A dozen men poured out into the falling snow. They weren't wearing police uniforms. They were wearing dark tactical gear, heavy winter coats, and they were carrying suppressed automatic weapons. They were looking directly up at her building. "No, no, no!" Sarah chanted, backing away from the window. The tracker hadn't just been a precaution, it was a beacon, and it had led the monsters right to her door. The heavy thud of combat boots, echoing up the narrow wooden stairwell of the apartment building, sounded like the drumbeat of an execution. Sarah spun around in her cramped living room, her eyes darting wildly for a weapon, an exit, anything. But there was only the front door, the fire escape in the kitchen that was rusted shut, and the bedroom where baby Mia slept. She ran to the kitchen drawer and grabbed the largest butcher knife she owned, a pathetic defense against men armed with assault rifles, but she refused to die empty-handed. She sprinted into the bedroom, scooped Mia up from the bed, and backed herself into the furthest corner of the room, clutching the baby to her chest with one arm, the knife raised with the other. Crack! The sound of her front door being kicked off its hinges was deafening. Wood splintered and shattered, hitting the walls of the small apartment. "Clear the kitchen. Check the back," a gruff voice barked. Heavy footsteps swarmed her living room. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping over her cheap furniture. Sarah held her breath, pressing a trembling hand over Mia's tiny back, praying the baby wouldn't wake up and cry. "In here I've got movement in the bedroom." The bedroom door was violently shoved open, slamming against the drywall. 3 men filled the doorway, their guns raised and pointed directly at Sarah's head. The laser sights painted bright red dots across her pale face and chest. Sarah didn't scream. The sheer terror paralyzed her vocal cords. She just held the knife up, shaking uncontrollably, shielding the baby with her body. "Drop the knife!" the lead man shouted. He was a mountain of a man with a scarred jaw and cold, dead eyes. "Don't come near us!" Sarah managed to choke out her voice, cracking. "I didn't do anything. Stand down, Victor," a new voice commanded from the living room. It was a low, resonant baritone that sent a chilling vibration through the floorboards. It was a voice that commanded empires. The armed men instantly parted, lowering their weapons, slightly creating a path. Stepping into the doorway of the bedroom was Lorenzo Moretti. He looked exactly like the picture on the news, but infinitely more terrifying in person. He wore a dark, tailored suit that was ruined, stained with dark, drying blood, and covered in the ash and dust of a gunfight. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying composure, but his dark eyes burned with a grief and rage so intense it felt suffocating. He stopped a few feet away from Sarah, his gaze dropping from her terrified face to the bundle in her arms. "My daughter," Lorenzo said, his voice barely above a whisper, carrying a dangerous edge. "You have my daughter." "I found her," Sarah blurted out, her grip on the knife tightening. "I swear to God I found her in a dumpster, in the Astor district. I didn't take her." Lorenzo took a slow step forward. "A dumpster. You expect me to believe a maid from Pilsen just happened to find my bloodline in the trash, took her home, and didn't call the police? If I called the police, she would be dead." Sarah yelled, tears of frustration and fear finally spilling over her cheeks. "Your own people put her there. Someone wrapped her in a bloody jacket and threw her away to freeze to death. Look at her wrist." Lorenzo paused. He looked at the baby. Mia was awake now, staring up with wide, innocent eyes. He saw the heavy gold crest dangling loosely around her tiny arm. "Give her to me," Lorenzo commanded, holding out his hands. Sarah hesitated. She looked at Lorenzo, then at the heavily armed men surrounding him. "How do I know I can trust you? How do I know you didn't want her gone?" A flash of genuine shock, followed by a terrifying, murderous anger, crossed Lorenzo's face. "She is my flesh and blood. I would burn this entire city to the ground to keep her warm. Give her to me. Now." Slowly seeing the desperate truth in the man's eyes, Sarah lowered the knife. It clattered to the floor. She took a step forward and gently placed the bundle into Lorenzo's large, calloused hands. The Mafia Boss held the infant to his chest. For a split second, the terrifying syndicate leader vanished, replaced by a broken father. He closed his eyes, pressing his lips to the baby's forehead. "Mia, grazia a Dio," he whispered. He opened his eyes and looked at Sarah. The anger was gone, replaced by a calculating intensity. "You saved her. You kept her warm." "I tried," Sarah whispered. "Boss, Victor." The scarred man stepped forward, his voice tight. "We have the kid. Let's finish the loose end and get out of here. The cops will be responding to the noise soon." Victor raised his weapon, aiming it directly at Sarah's chest. Sarah gasped, stumbling backward against the wall. She closed her eyes, waiting for the gunshot. "No." Lorenzo's voice cracked like a whip. "She saved my daughter. She comes with us." "Put the gun down, Victor." But Victor didn't lower his weapon. Instead, he slowly shifted his aim. The barrel moved away from Sarah and leveled directly at the center of Lorenzo Moretti's back. "I'm sorry, Lorenzo," Victor said, his voice dripping with venom. "But the boss said the entire bloodline ends tonight. You weren't supposed to survive the estate, and the rat wasn't supposed to be found." Sarah's eyes shot wide open. She saw the betrayer. She saw the finger squeezing the trigger. "Lorenzo, behind you!" Sarah screamed, lunging forward with a speed she didn't know she possessed. She didn't reach for Lorenzo. She reached for the heavy brass floor lamp, standing next to the bed, swinging it with all her might, just as the deafening roar of gunfire erupted inside the tiny apartment. The heavy brass base of the floor lamp connected with the side of Victor's skull with a sickening hollow crack. The impact violently jerked the massive man's head to the right, just as his finger depressed the trigger of his suppressed automatic rifle. The gun barked a rapid pft, but the deadly spray of bullets missed Lorenzo Moretti's back by mere inches. Instead, the high-caliber rounds chewed through the cheap drywall of Sarah's bedroom, sending plumes of white dust and shredded insulation exploding into the claustrophobic air. Time seemed to fracture, slowing down to a terrifying crawl for Sarah as the lamp slipped from her numb fingers. Lorenzo's reaction was terrifyingly instantaneous. He didn't flinch. He didn't dive for cover. With the reflexes of a predator honed by decades of surviving the Chicago underworld, he pivoted on his heel, seamlessly shifting baby Mia to his left arm, while his right hand blurred toward the holster concealed at his waist. Before Victor could recover his balance and realign his weapon, Lorenzo's custom Kimber 1911 was drawn and leveled. Two deafening shots roared in the confined space of the apartment, drowning out the suppressed fire. The muzzle flash illuminated the room in stark, violent strobe light. Victor's eyes went wide, his body jolting backward as two hollow-point rounds struck him dead center in the chest. The betrayer crumpled to the floor, his heavy combat boots thrashing once against the cheap linoleum, before he went entirely still. Chaos instantly erupted in the living room. The remaining men, some loyal to Lorenzo, others clearly bought off by whoever orchestrated the hit, turned their weapons on each other. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire tore through the thin walls of the Pilsen apartment. Screams echoed from the hallway as neighbors finally woke to the nightmare unfolding above the laundromat. "Move!" Lorenzo roared over the deafening gunfire. He didn't wait for Sarah's paralyzed legs to obey. He grabbed her by the collar of her cheap wool coat, yanking her out of the firing line, just as a spray of bullets shattered the bedroom window, raining jagged glass over the mattress where Mia had been sleeping moments before. "The fire escape!" Sarah screamed, pointing toward the cramped kitchen. "It's rusted, but I can kick it open." Lorenzo shoved her forward, shielding her and the baby with his own broad shoulders. They scrambled through the debris of the living room, slipping on spent brass casings. A rogue bullet shattered the lone light bulb hanging from the kitchen ceiling, plunging them into darkness. Sarah threw herself at the kitchen window, unlatching it and ramming her shoulder against the warped wooden frame. It groaned, but didn't give. Panic clawed at her throat. The sound of heavy footsteps was rushing toward the kitchen entrance. "Stand back," Lorenzo commanded. He raised his heavy boot and kicked the window frame with bone-shattering force. The wood splintered, and the entire window unit blew outward onto the rusted metal platform of the fire escape. The freezing Chicago wind immediately howled into the apartment, biting at their skin. "Go, down the alley, do not stop!" Lorenzo ordered, shoving the infant back into Sarah's arms. Mia was wailing now, a high-pitched sound of pure distress that cut through the gunfire. Sarah scrambled out onto the icy metal, grating her breath, pluming in the frigid air. She clutched Mia tightly, descending the terrifyingly slippery iron stairs as fast as her legs could carry her. Lorenzo was right behind her, firing controlled shots back into the apartment to keep their pursuers pinned down. They hit the cobblestone of the alleyway just as the distant rising wail of police sirens pierced the night. Pilsen was lighting up. This way. Lorenzo grabbed her arm, dragging her away from the flashing red and blue lights that were beginning to reflect off the brick buildings at the end of the block. They sprinted through a labyrinth of narrow gangways and trash-filled alleys, Lorenzo navigating the dark urban maze with a terrifying familiarity. He was bleeding. Sarah could see the dark, wet stain spreading rapidly across the shoulder of his ruined dress shirt, but the man didn't even wince. He moved with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train. 2 blocks away, Lorenzo stopped abruptly next to an unmarked, unremarkable dark grey sedan parked legally under a burnt-out street lamp. He smashed the driver's side window. With the butt of his pistol, reached in to unlock it and opened the rear door. "Get in. Keep the child below the window line," he barked, sliding into the driver's seat. Sarah scrambled into the back, huddling on the floorboards, wrapping herself entirely around Mia to muffle the baby's cries and shield her from the freezing air whipping through the shattered window. Lorenzo reached under the steering column. Within 5 seconds, the engine roared to life. He threw the car into drive, peeling away from the curb, just as a pair of Chicago police cruisers sped past the intersection, completely oblivious to the syndicate boss, escaping into the shadows. Lorenzo didn't take the highways. He took the industrial back roads, weaving through the desolate warehouse districts before plunging the car into the subterranean concrete labyrinth of Lower Wacker Drive. Down here, beneath the glittering skyscrapers of the city, GPS trackers failed and cameras were blind. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling violently as the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving her freezing and terrified. Lorenzo's dark eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. They were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of mercy. "We are going to a place that doesn't exist, because as of tonight, Lorenzo Moretti is officially a dead man." The safe house was a massive decommissioned meatpacking facility on the industrial edge of the West Loop. From the outside, it looked like a condemned relic of Chicago's past, its brick facade tagged with gang graffiti, and its windows boarded up with rotting plywood. But as Lorenzo drove the stolen sedan through a concealed heavy steel bay door that rolled up on a silent oiled track, the interior revealed a completely different reality. It was a fortified bunker. Harsh industrial halogen lights hummed to life, illuminating reinforced concrete walls, a massive arsenal of weaponry locked behind steel cages, and a sleek, modern living quarter built directly into the center of the warehouse floor. It was completely isolated, deeply secure and terrifyingly cold. Lorenzo killed the engine and stepped out of the car. The moment his boots hit the concrete, his formidable posture faltered. He swayed, catching himself against the hood of the car, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his clenched teeth. Sarah scrambled out of the back seat, holding the now quiet baby. She saw the blood dripping down Lorenzo's sleeve, pooling on the concrete floor. The adrenaline that had kept him upright was finally crashing. "You're shot!" Sarah said, rushing toward him, her instincts as a caretaker overriding her absolute terror of the man. "It's a graze!" Lorenzo grunted, pushing himself off the car and limping toward the living quarters. "Put Mia in the back room. There is a clean bed." Sarah quickly did as she was told, laying the exhausted infant on a surprisingly plush, king-sized bed in a stark, windowless bedroom. She barricaded the baby with pillows, just as she had in her own apartment, before hurrying back to the main area. She found Lorenzo sitting on a stainless steel medical prep table. He had stripped off his ruined shirt, revealing a torso heavily scarred by old violence, and a fresh, ugly gouge carved deeply across his right deltoid. The bullet hadn't lodged, but it had torn a significant chunk of flesh away. He was attempting to clean it with pouring alcohol, his jaw locked in silent agony. "Stop, you're making a mess," Sarah said, her voice finding a sudden, unexpected firmness. She walked over to the open medical kit on the table. "My mother had end-stage renal failure. I spent 4 years managing her at-home care, dealing with blowouts, collapsed veins, and open wounds. Move your hand." Lorenzo looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing. For a moment, the dangerous mafia boss bristled at being ordered around by a terrified 24-year-old maid, but he saw the grim determination in her eyes. Slowly he lowered his hand. Sarah went to work. Her hands, rough from years of scrubbing chemical cleaners, were surprisingly gentle and precise. She flushed the wound with saline, packed it tightly with sterile gauze to stop the bleeding, and began taping it down with practiced efficiency. The silence in the bunker was heavy, broken only by the hum of the industrial heaters kicking on. "Why did you save my life?" Lorenzo asked, his deep voice breaking the quiet. He didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead at the concrete wall. "Victor had a gun to my back. You could have let him pull the trigger. You could have walked away from the crossfire." "I didn't think," Sarah admitted quietly, securing the last piece of medical tape. "I just saw a man about to be murdered by his own friend. I saw a father who had just lost his wife, holding his baby. I don't care who you are or what the news says you do. Nobody deserves to be shot in the back." Lorenzo finally turned his head to look at her. The coldness in his eyes had receded, replaced by a profound, heavy sorrow. "They killed my Isabella. They butchered my men in their sleep. They put my daughter in a bag and threw her in the garbage." His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "And the man who gave the order was my own brother." Sarah froze, the bloody gauze slipping from her fingers. "Your brother." "Julian Vitiello." Lorenzo spat the name as if it were poison. "He is my half-brother, the underboss of this syndicate. He has always coveted the chair, but I never believed he would break omerta to take it. He must have bought off half my capos to pull off a coordinated strike this massive." Lorenzo ran a heavy hand over his face. "He controls the police. He controls the port. By morning, he will control the entire city's underworld. And he will not stop hunting us until he is certain Mia and I are dead." Sarah walked over to the industrial sink to wash the blood from her hands. The soap was harsh, stinging the small cuts on her knuckles. "So what do we do? We can't stay hidden in a meat locker forever. They tracked me once with a GPS bug. They'll find a way to track you. Julian is paranoid. He will retreat to his stronghold to consolidate his power and root out any remaining loyalists to me." Lorenzo explained, his mind already shifting from grief to tactical warfare. "He lives in the penthouse of the St. Regis on the Gold Coast. It is a fortress. Bulletproof glass private elevators requiring biometrics, and a heavily armed private security detail stationed in the lobby and the skybridge. It is impenetrable from the outside. If I try to siege it, I will be gunned down before I reach the lobby." Sarah stopped scrubbing her hands. She turned the water off the sudden silence, rushing back into the room. She stared at the suds draining down the stainless steel sink, a crazy, suicidal thought forming in her mind. "The St. Regis," Sarah murmured, drying her hands on a towel. "Yes, the crown jewel of Chicago real estate," Lorenzo sneered. "A fitting throne for a traitor." Sarah turned around to face the most dangerous man in the city. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her voice was dead calm. "It's not impenetrable," Sarah said. Lorenzo raised an eyebrow, a mix of skepticism and annoyance crossing his features. I assure you, Sarah, it is. I helped design the security protocols for that building. You designed the security for external threats, Sarah countered, taking a step toward him. You designed it to keep assassins' rival families and the FBI out, but you didn't design it to keep the help out. Lorenzo stared at her, not understanding. I work for Elite Sweeps, Sarah said, pulling her cheap plastic employee ID badge from the pocket of her ruined coat. She tossed it onto the metal table next to his gun. We hold exclusive bonded contracts for the ultra-wealthy. We are the ghosts who scrub their toilets, polish their marble, and empty their trash without ever making eye contact. We are completely invisible. Lorenzo picked up the cheap piece of plastic, looking at her smiling, exhausted face in the photo. And Julian Vitiello is one of our premium clients, Sarah said, dropping the bombshell. Every Tuesday and Friday at 4 a.m., a two-person cleaning crew is cleared through the service entrance. We have a master override keycard to the private service elevator that bypasses the biometric scanners in the lobby. We go straight up to the penthouse kitchen. Lorenzo's eyes widened slightly, the tactical brilliance of the revelation washing over him. The impossible fortress had a back door, and the key was currently standing in front of him in a blood-stained thrift store coat. You have access to this keycard? Lorenzo asked, his voice tightening with a sudden dangerous hope. It's locked in the dispatcher's office at my company headquarters in River North, Sarah said. But the manager leaves the back window unlatched so the night crews can sneak out for smoke breaks. I can get in. I can get the card. Lorenzo slowly slid off the metal table, his imposing frame towering over her despite his injury. He looked at her not as a victim and not as a maid, but as a crucial asset. A soldier. If you do this, there is no going back to your old life, Sarah. Lorenzo warned, his tone deadly serious. Julian is a monster. If he catches you, he will not give you a quick death. You will be tortured for information on my whereabouts. You owe me nothing. You saved my daughter. I can give you a bag of cash right now and put you on a private jet to Europe. Sarah thought about her life. The crushing medical debt, the miserable freezing apartment, the endless hours scrubbing floors for billionaires who treated her like a piece of furniture. And then she thought about Mea, the tiny, innocent life sleeping in the next room, and the mother who had been slaughtered to protect her. My mother died because I couldn't afford a transplant, Sarah said, her voice shaking with a quiet, suppressed rage. I have spent my whole life being stepped on by men with power. Men like your brother. She looked Lorenzo dead in the eye. I want to help you burn his fortress to the ground. The transformation began an hour later. Lorenzo moved through the armory with practiced lethal efficiency. He selected a sleek, matte black suppressed submachine gun, strapping extra magazines to a tactical vest. We strike tonight, Lorenzo said, loading a sidearm. Julian will be celebrating. He will be arrogant. He will assume I am bleeding out in a ditch somewhere. That arrogance is his fatal flaw. Sarah watched him, feeling entirely out of her depth. How do we get you past the lobby? Even with the service keycard, the service elevator has a camera. You aren't taking me through the lobby, Lorenzo replied, tossing her a heavy black canvas duffel bag, identical to the one she had pulled from the dumpster, only clean. You are taking me out with the trash. Sarah blinked. What? The service elevator is used for bringing up supplies and taking down the heavy industrial trash bins, Lorenzo explained, unrolling a large blueprint of the St. Regis on the metal table. The security detail at the bottom checks the carts going up for weapons. They do not check the rotting garbage going down. They just wave the maids through to the compactor room. He tapped a finger on the blueprint. You will go into the building in your uniform. You will take the service elevator up to Julian's penthouse. You will take one of the heavy-duty rolling laundry bins, empty it, and bring it back down to the loading dock. I will be waiting in the alley. I get in the bin, you cover me with dirty linens, and you wheel me right past the guards and up the private elevator. It was insane. It was a suicide mission masked as a housekeeping duty. And it was brilliant. If the guards stop me, if they look inside, Sarah whispered, the reality of the danger finally sinking her stomach like a stone. They won't, Lorenzo said softly, stepping closer to her. He reached out his large, calloused hand, gently gripping her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her in comfort, and the warmth of his hand sent a startling jolt through her chest. They are men who rely on intimidation. They see a maid, they see subservience. Keep your head down. Look terrified of their authority. Play the part you have played your entire life, Sarah. Be invisible. Leaving Mia sleeping soundly in the heavily fortified bunker, monitored by a closed-circuit camera, Lorenzo hooked up to a secure tablet. They moved out. The infiltration of the elite sweeps headquarters in River North was absurdly easy. Sarah slipped through the unlatched smoking window, creeping through the dark, familiar cubicles. She held her breath, expecting alarms to blare, but the office was dead quiet. She broke the cheap lock on the dispatcher's drawer with a letter opener, her hands shaking as she pulled out the heavy black magnetic keycard emblazoned with the gold St. Regis logo. By 4:15 a.m., the city of Chicago was wrapped in a freezing pre-dawn fog. The massive glass towers of the Gold Coast loomed like monolithic tombstones in the mist. Sarah, dressed in her blue elite sweeps uniform, her hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun, walked down the damp concrete ramp toward the subterranean loading dock of the St. Regis. Her heart was beating so violently against her ribs, she was terrified the guards would hear it. Two men in sharp, tactical suits were leaning against the concrete wall near the service entrance. They weren't building security. They had the cold, dead-eyed look of cartel muscle. Julian's men. They were smoking cigarettes, the cherry-red tips flaring in the gloom. "Hold it!" the taller guard barked, stepping in front of Sarah, blocking the heavy metal door. He looked her up and down, a cruel sneer on his face. "Cleaning crew isn't scheduled until later." Sarah forced her shoulders to slump. She stared fixedly at the guard's shiny leather shoes, adopting the meek, terrified posture she had perfected over years of dealing with abusive clients. I'm so sorry, sir," Sarah stammered, making her voice waver perfectly. Mr. Vitiello's assistant called the emergency line, said there was a massive spill in the primary dining room. Wine, I think. They said if I didn't get here immediately to treat the marble, I'd be fired. Please, I can't lose this job. The guard blew a cloud of smoke directly into her face. He glanced at her cheap uniform, her worn-out shoes, and the plastic bucket of cleaning supplies in her trembling hands. To him, she wasn't a threat. She was an insect. He scoffed, stepping aside. "Make it quick, and don't look at anyone in the penthouse. Keep your eyes on the floor." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir," Sarah squeaked. She swiped the black card against the scanner. The light blinked green, and the heavy metal door clicked open. She was in. Sarah navigated the sterile, fluorescent-lit concrete corridors of the basement, ignoring the camera domes mounted on the ceiling. She found the staging room, grabbed a massive, waist-high canvas laundry cart, and wheeled it back out toward the designated alleyway access door. She pushed the door open. The alley was dark, shrouded in fog. For a terrifying second, she thought Lorenzo wasn't there. Then a shadow detached itself from the brick wall. Lorenzo moved with silent, lethal grace, slipping through the door before it could swing shut. He was dressed entirely in black tactical gear, his face obscured by a dark mask, his eyes burning with a murderous intent. Without a word, he climbed into the heavy canvas laundry cart. He folded his massive frame into the bottom. Sarah immediately grabbed 3 bags of soiled, sour-smelling restaurant linens from a nearby bin and dumped them directly over him, completely burying the mafia boss. She took a deep breath, gripping the handles of the cart. She wheeled the heavy cart back down the corridor, her tires squeaking loudly against the polished concrete. As she approached the private service elevator, the two guards from the loading dock stepped in front of the doors. "What's in the cart?" the taller guard demanded, resting his hand casually on the grip of the pistol holstered at his hip. Sarah's blood turned to ice. This wasn't the plan. They weren't supposed to stop her on the way up. Just soiled linens from the lower banquet hall, sir." Sarah lied, her voice cracking. "I have to take them up to the service chute." The guard narrowed his eyes. He took a step forward, reaching his hand out toward the pile of dirty white sheets covering Lorenzo Moretti. "Let's have a look," the guard said, his fingers gripping the edge of the linen. Sarah stopped breathing. If he pulled that sheet back, the entire building would erupt in gunfire, and she would be the first one to die. The taller guard's thick fingers gripped the edge of the stained white tablecloth, ready to yank it back and expose the heavily armed syndicate boss hiding beneath. Sarah's mind went entirely blank. She had no weapon, no training, and a fraction of a second to act. Instinct born not from violence, but from years of dealing with the absolute worst of human messes took over. "I wouldn't touch that bare-handed sir," Sarah blurted out, her voice pitching up in a perfect panicked squeak. The guard paused, his brow furrowing. "Why?" Sarah visibly shuddered, leaning closer and dropping her voice into a conspiratorial, disgusted whisper. "It's from the VIP suite on the 4th floor. The guest, well, he contracted severe rotavirus. It's coming out of both ends, sir. That top sheet, it's completely soaked in diarrhea and vomit. The smell hasn't hit you yet, because the fabric is thick, but if you pull it back—" She mimed a gag, her face contorting in genuine revulsion at the thought of her own lie. The guard's face instantly drained of color. He looked down at his hand, which was gripping the fabric, and snatched it back as if the linen had burned him. He aggressively wiped his palm on his tactical trousers, a look of profound disgust washing over his hardened features. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, stepping back and waving her toward the heavy metal doors of the service elevator. "Get that biohazard out of here. Move." Sarah didn't hesitate. She shoved the heavy canvas cart forward, rolling it into the stainless steel interior of the elevator. The doors slid shut, cutting off the guards, the alley, and the freezing fog. The moment the elevator engaged, rocketing upward toward the penthouse, Sarah collapsed against the back wall, her knees buckling as she gasped for air. "You can breathe now, Sarah." Lorenzo's deep, muffled voice came from beneath the pile of fictitious bodily fluids. That was brilliant. The elevator chimed at the 89th floor. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the sprawling, multi-million-dollar kitchen of Julian Vitiello's penthouse. It was a masterpiece of black marble, brushed gold, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline of Chicago. Sarah pushed the cart into the center of the kitchen and locked the wheels. She quickly pulled the linens away. Lorenzo rose from the cart like a shadow, his silenced submachine gun already raised, and scanning the room. He stepped out, shaking the stiffness from his injured shoulder. He looked at Sarah, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The cold, unfeeling mafia boss was gone. In his gaze was a profound, undeniable respect. "Stay in this room," Lorenzo commanded softly. "Lock the service door behind me. Do not come out until I call your name." Sarah nodded, stepping back into the shadows of the massive double refrigerators. Lorenzo moved out of the kitchen with the terrifying silence of an apex predator. He didn't rush. He drifted through the opulent, dimly lit corridors of the penthouse. In the grand living room, Julian Vitiello sat in a custom leather armchair, an expensive crystal tumbler of amber scotch in his hand. He was a younger, sharper and crueler version of Lorenzo, wearing a silk robe and staring out at the city he believed he now owned. 2 heavily armed bodyguards flanked the mahogany double doors leading to the private elevator. Put. The suppressed shots were barely a whisper over the smooth jazz playing on the high-end sound system. The 2 bodyguards dropped to the imported Persian rug, simultaneously hollow-point rounds severing their brain stems before they even registered the threat. Julian didn't notice. He took a sip of his scotch, smiling at his reflection in the reinforced glass. You pour a cheap blended scotch to celebrate a victory, Julian. Your taste was always an embarrassment to this family. Julian froze. The tumbler slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor, splashing amber liquid over his bare feet. He spun around his face, twisting in absolute horror. Lorenzo stepped out of the shadows, his weapon aimed directly at his brother's chest. He looked like an avenging ghost covered in blood and dust. Lorenzo. Julian choked out, taking a stumbling step backward. How? The estate. Victor said it was done. Victor is dead, along with the rest of the garbage you sent to my home. Lorenzo said, his voice a low, lethal hum. Did you really think you could take my throne, Julian? Did you think you could slaughter my wife and throw my daughter in a dumpster, and I would just quietly bleed out in an alley? Julian's panic morphed into a desperate, cornered sneer. You're a dead man walking, Lorenzo. My men control the lobby. You fire that gun, and a dozen shooters will flood this room. You can't escape. I don't need to escape. I own the building, Lorenzo replied smoothly. He reached into his tactical vest with his free hand and pulled out a small encrypted satellite phone. And I don't need to fire a single shot to destroy you. Lorenzo tossed the phone onto the coffee table. The screen was lit up, showing an active multi-party conference call. While I was bleeding in a meat locker, I made a few calls. Lorenzo explained, stepping closer. I called the heads of the New York, Boston, and Vegas families. I played them the security footage from my estate. I showed them you breaking the sacred rule of omerta, ordering a hit on a sitting boss, and worse, targeting an innocent child. Julian looked at the phone, the color completely draining from his face. You have no allies left, little brother, Lorenzo whispered. The commission has declared you infame. Your accounts have been frozen. Your capos have already been given the green light to take your head for a bounty. The men in the lobby, they aren't yours anymore. They are waiting for me to walk out. Julian let out a pathetic, animalistic cry and lunged toward a decorative pistol sitting on his desk. He never made it halfway. Lorenzo didn't use the submachine gun. He drew the Kimber 1911 from his hip, the same gun he used to kill Victor, and fired one deafening, unsuppressed shot. The bullet caught Julian squarely in the forehead. The traitor collapsed his reign over the Chicago underworld, ending before the sun even rose. Lorenzo looked down at the body of his brother. He felt no triumph, only a heavy, exhausting finality. He holstered his weapon and turned away, walking back through the silent penthouse. When he pushed open the kitchen doors, Sarah was standing exactly where he left her, clutching her hands to her chest, her eyes wide with terror at the sound of the gunshot. It's over, Lorenzo said softly. He walked over to her. Without a word, the terrifying, blood-soaked syndicate boss wrapped his uninjured arm around the trembling maid, pulling her into a fierce, protective embrace. For the first time in 24 hours, Sarah broke down, sobbing quietly, into his tactical vest as the adrenaline finally left her body. The wind off Lake Michigan was warm, carrying the scent of blooming hydrangeas through the open French doors of the massive, highly secure estate in Lake Forest. Sarah Jenkins was no longer wearing a cheap blue uniform. She wore a simple, elegant white sundress, sitting on a plush sofa in the sun-drenched nursery. In her arms was a healthy, laughing Mia, playfully tugging at a diamond necklace around Sarah's neck, a gift that cost more than Sarah had made in a decade of cleaning floors. The heavy oak door to the nursery pushed open, and Lorenzo stepped inside. He wore a crisp, dark suit, the scars of the winter hidden beneath expensive Italian tailoring. His dark eyes softened the moment they landed on the two of them. He walked over, leaning down to press a kiss to his daughter's head, and then slowly he pressed a kiss to Sarah's cheek. "The board meeting is finished," Lorenzo murmured, his hand resting gently on Sarah's shoulder. "The transition to the legitimate shipping fronts is almost complete. No more blood." Sarah looked up at him, smiling softly. She wasn't an employee anymore. She wasn't just the woman who saved his daughter. She was the woman who had stood beside him in the darkest night of his life, pulling him back from the edge of absolute destruction. "Good," Sarah said, resting her hand over his. "Because you have a tea party to attend to. Mr. Moretti and Mia is very strict about punctuality." Lorenzo chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound of genuine happiness that still surprised his men. The Mafia Boss had lost his empire of shadows, but as he looked at Sarah and his daughter, he knew he had gained something infinitely more powerful. And that's the incredible heart-stopping conclusion to poor Maid who found the Mafia Boss's daughter in a dumpster. What a wild ride from a freezing Chicago alleyway to the absolute top of the underworld empire. If Sarah and Lorenzo's epic journey from a desperate fight for survival to an unexpected, beautiful romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this thrilling video with your fellow drama lovers and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another crazy story. Let us know in the comments, what was your favorite plot twist? See you next time.